What it do? After a nice, very long 9 months, I am finally back doing quality non-smite content. Tank my views, but yes, non-smite content. I know you're all thankful for that. And I think the perfect way to get back into the groove of these things is by reviewing one of my favorite games of the year, Strangers of Paradise Final Fantasy Origins. Now, if you don't know how I do these reviews, it's pretty much a spoiler free review going all over the core tenets of the game gameplay, the minutiae, difficulty, soundtrack, all of that to help you decide should you buy this game, and if so, at what price point. Today's game of choice will be Strangers of Paradise, the action RPG Souls-like created by Koei Tecmo's Team Ninja, the same people who brought you Ninja Gaiden, Dead or Alive, and the game this is most reminiscent of, Neo. So without further ado, I'm just going to get right into it with the combat and gameplay. If there's anything you could say positive about this game, I'm positive that everyone would say the combat and the gameplay. This is probably one of the most fluid and satisfying gameplay loops that I've had the enjoyment of playing in the past few years. It truly is, at its core, just a mixture of Neo 2, classic Final Fantasy job systems, and the year 2005. This game strikes a great balance between every single weapon to where all of them feel really impactful and nice to use. I don't think there was ever a point in the game where I didn't like a weapon so much that I never wanted to use it again. This is one of the few games where I've experimented out and reached out to a bunch of different classes and stuff I would never use. Typically, I pick up a lance and that's my main weapon for the whole game, but in this one, I felt incentivized to go out and try every single weapon, and all of them felt good. I'd really think you could choose any sort of weapon with any sort of job in this game and you could find some success, and I think that's a great thing for a game like this. A cool part about the weapons is that they get even more unique with different action abilities. You can utilize different weapons in different jobs, and if there's a certain ability for that certain weapon, you can combine all of them, especially once you get to the expert classes, to formulate your own playstyle. For example, me and my friend both used lances, but most of his skills were from the Lancer class, and mine were mostly from the Dragoon class. We had the same weapon, but we had completely different abilities, which I think is a very nice touch and adds a lot of variety. These attacks use up MP, which is the bread and butter to your playstyle and the gameplay loop. You can refill your MP using the Soul Shield, the Soul Burst, or by breaking things around the area. One of the really cool parts about this gameplay loop is all the different ways you can mitigate damage. You have your classic guarding and dodging, but you have a cool thing in this game called the Soul Shield. It functions a lot similar to guarding, but it's a lot harder to pull off with how much it takes out of your break gauge. The added benefit though, instead of guarding, is that it refills your MP and it gives you more maximum MP you could use and can even absorb certain attacks that you could use for yourself. You can tell which attacks are absorbable by if they have a purple background on the text above them. Mastering which of these to use at the right time is a real cool progression to see throughout the game. Eventually you get to a point where you just know which attacks you should be using the soul shield on, which ones you should be dodging, and you develop your own playstyle around it. And I think it's a really cool development having all of these different options, because late game, when you get to all these really cool boss fights, you feel like you're using every single bit of knowledge at your disposal to take down these hard bosses. There's other traditional RPG stuff in the game, such as a break gauge for yourself and the enemies. If you get an enemy's break gauge down enough, you'll do a nice cool finisher attack that recharges your MP. Bosses and enemies have breakable parts where if you hit it, you can disable some of their attacks and expose weak points for doing more damage. There's unblockable attacks, rolling instead of simply dodging. There's status ailments and all that other jazz. Typical RPG stuff, but it all functions really well together as a unit. The gameplay loop is broken up by the existence of cubes, and this is pretty much where you refill your potions, heal up, and get to allocate your job points. You start out every level with 5 potions, and every time you reach a cube, you get 5 more potions. These are pretty much the bonfires, in a sense, of this game. All in all, this is just one of my favorite gameplay loops in recent memory. It's just really fluid, really fun, and I think it's something you really need to try for yourself. If there's anything you could say positive, and if you don't like anything else in the game, I'm positive that you would like the combat. It's something universal that if you like action RPGs, especially Souls-likes, yeah, you're gonna like this game. Alongside the combat we have the job system. So basically you have different weapon types which affect the different jobs you can use, which affect the different abilities and stats you could have. You start out with only basic jobs which correlate to a certain weapon. Pugilist is just using your fists, Lancer is of course using a lance, But as you go on and level up these jobs, you can unlock advanced jobs. Unlocking up these advanced jobs, and then you can unlock expert jobs. What I think is really cool about this system is how seamless the transitions were. Whenever I was starting out a new class or job, I didn't feel like I was starting straight out from zero. If you have a certain ability for your weapon from a different class, you can carry that over if you still have that same weapon. Stuff like that's cool, and I think it makes it much more seamless. I think it strikes the perfect balance to where there is a progression and you feel better for being deeper into that progression, but you don't feel completely worthless when you're just starting out a new class. This really incentivizes experimenting and mix matching different classes because you can have up to 2 on you at a time, and you can switch of them at will, which is really cool. There is job mastery, but yeah, this goes into the post-game section, but it's really nothing. Level 30 is pretty much your cap. I'll delve deep into higher leveling your classes past 30 in a little bit, but it's really nothing too special. Now, the first contentious point I have with this game is with its loot system. I don't really think it's a problem in of itself, and I haven't really seen how it compares to Neo, but I'm assuming that it's similar, but there is way too much loot in this game. By way too much loot, I mean most of it doesn't really matter. Until you're late game, min-maxing and attributing all of your gear correctly does not matter at all. I've seen really cool late game builds where they min-max attributes and they get the perfect stat allotment, but until you're at that level, it really does not matter. You're pretty much just going with whatever's the highest level and giving you the best stats. Now, I think having more loot's a better problem than having less loot, but especially when the game was at launch with no auto dismantle, you were spending way too much time dismantling loot you didn't need. After every mission, me and my friend were spending about 10-15 minutes just dismantling loot, and I think that really takes you out of the flow spending that much time in the menus. They're really cool builds, but I think slamming that much loot at you in the early game just feels lame. It does not feel fun sitting in menus for extended periods of time dismantling loot over and over one by one. I think the loot in the end game has a purpose, but you kind of have to suffer early and mid game for it. Back to the positives, we have the enemies and the bosses. What's really cool is seeing a bunch of classic Final Fantasy enemies reimagined but in a very cool, nice 3D looking way. I think there was a lot of enemy variety. All the different enemy types serve a purpose. You gotta see a lot of classics. You have stuff like the Cactar, you get the Tonberry, you have bombs, you have everything. If you could think of it, it's probably gonna be there, and it's really cool. It never feels like the variety starts to wane or start falling off towards the late game. It doesn't feel like there's just reskins for the sake of having reskins at the end game. And I think it's a really nice variety. It feels good. It feels good fighting these enemies, and I think there's a very good mix of them that makes gameplay unique and fun with all the different enemy combos you could have. Now, boss fights, I have a lot of great things to say about the bosses. I think this is one of the best games boss fight-wise. I think they were all very unique and very fun. I think when you're starting out early game, you're still getting acclimated to the game, and it feels a lot harder than it probably should be, but it teaches you that this game is in fact a Souls-like. This is a Neo-type game, and I think it works really well. Whenever bosses have gimmicks, I think it's really cool, because each boss even has certain attacks that you can absorb using your soul shield. There's different things where you could spark one of their weaknesses, and it's really cool. The best fights happen late game though, where it just feels like peak Dark Souls bosses, where it's just a duel between two players who are almost equally matched in skill, and that stuff like that is really fun. Like the final boss of this game, I loved. Going from getting my ass handed to me within seconds to being able to do the whole fight without using a single potion, stuff like that is great. It just feels like a well choreographed dance between two warriors at their strength, at their highest point, and it's really cool. I think all of the boss fights in this game are great. I think a lot of them are memorable, and there weren't too many where I was like, yeah, this is just too tedious. I thought all of them were very fun, even in multiplayer. Now this next part is probably one of the most divisive parts of the game, and for good reason, because even I can agree as someone who likes it. It's very campy, and until the third act, the story's not going to make sense. All you know is you're Jack Garland, you have a rock that two other people have, and you all want to destroy chaos. That's about it. This game and Jack himself are like basically ripped from 2005. Yeah, it's really that campy and that edgy. This doesn't really rub off a lot well on certain people, and I can see why people won't like it. I also think there's a very big dichotomy between the first two acts and the third one. The story actually starts getting quite serious and dark during the third act, and it's such an odd transition going from the very edgy, interrupting villain monologues that you see Jack do to this completely dark back undertone that the later acts have. I think if the whole game held that same tone but weaved in the edgy campy humor better, it would be much more well received. I think the characters not named Jack are also pretty lame in their own part. I don't really remember any NPCs, I don't really remember any of them at all or anything notable they had to say. The party members are also pretty lame. I don't think in a Final Fantasy game you would want to have such forgettable characters. But I mean, you have Jed and Ash, and then you later unlock Neon and Sophia, but I really don't care about any of them. Jack's pretty much the only one who actually has a personality, it seems. You get glimpses of it in the third act, but again, you just don't get enough of them in the first two acts to make up for it. It feels more like wasted potential at its very best. One part of the game that I really don't have much of a like for is the level design. I like the fact that it's nostalgic and that pretty much almost every level is a callback to an older Final Fantasy. That stuff is really cool, being able to see these old classic NES titles reimagined in full 3D in this day and age in 2022. That stuff is really cool. But this falls into the Spider-Man No Way Home problem. A lot of nostalgia, not a lot of substance. Yeah, it's cool having those nostalgic moments, but if you don't have a connection to those people or those certain areas, it doesn't really feel anything special, and that feels even worse when the levels themselves aren't very cool. After a while, they get bland and boring, and some of them are just downright confusing and tedious to play through. Exploration in this game really just means you go down a different path, and hey, there's a chest or a tonberry or some extra loot. That's pretty much as far as it goes. Some levels dabble a little bit into gimmicks and puzzles, like the one based off of Final Fantasy XIII has you activating weather orbs to activate different paths. I wish there was more of this in the game. I wish there were different gimmicks and stuff that played off of the older games, so that there was a deeper connection and just more interesting level design in general if you don't have that connection. The nostalgia wears off fast, I think, especially on repeated playthroughs. I just stopped really caring about the areas because I've been there, I've seen it. It really wears off of the first time, and if you haven't played an older Final Fantasy game, it's not going to matter to you. I think the level design really leaves a lot to be desired. They're serviceable at best, and I think that's the biggest compliment it's going to get. We have one of the coolest, but also oddest part of the games, I guess is the best way to put it. The multiplayer. So, I think multiplayer is always just fun. Multiplayer makes bad games enjoyable and makes great games even better. The problem with this is that it's in a Souls-like game. Now, if you've ever played Code Vein or Elden Ring, you would probably know that multiplayer greatly diminishes difficulty, especially when you're fighting like gank boss fights like in Code Vein or Ornstein and Smough from Dark Souls. You can really tell that they were designed around one person and one person only. This game not only takes it to the point where you're splitting aggro and having one person who could just dodge and one to just lay into the boss, but you can use your potions to revive people and you have access to 3 Phoenix Downs to revive yourself. That's just where I think it's conflicting. Is it fun? Yes, I think it's great having a multiplayer Final Fantasy game and having a multiplayer Neo type game. But you're definitely not going to get the same difficulty, and I think that's the trade-off you have to make. When I first played the demo of this game, I was getting my ass handed to me admittedly at the boss fights, but every time I played with my friend, yeah, we pretty much just steamrolled everything our way. And later in the game, it wasn't so much steamrolling, there were still difficult parts, but I could tell that if I was playing solo, I would have had a much harder time. It's an odd trade-off. I like the multiplayer, honestly, but it's not going to be intuitive if you want a more difficult experience. And speaking of the difficulty, let's talk about that. It's definitely a Souls-like because it's made by the same people who made Neo. You can really feel that in the gameplay, and you can feel it in the difficulty. One thing I like about it though is it never felt too difficult. It doesn't veer too heavy into that Neo Souls-like type difficulty, but it's definitely not your average action RPG game. The difficulty peaks at the beginning when you're first learning all the new mechanics and getting used to the game, and towards the end game where you have to use every bit of knowledge to take down all the hard bosses and groups of enemies. The difficulty system is kinda lame though, I will say. It has the classic, easy, normal, hard, whatever. Me and my friend have played through the entire game on normal, we played a little bit on hard, and now we're playing on chaos mode on the post game, and yeah, it doesn't feel any different. The difficulties just make the enemies stronger or weaker. I think that stuff is pretty lame. Me and him first thought that you couldn't revive, but I think that would be a pretty cool addition. Again, I'm just really not a fan of that type of difficulty, especially in a game like this. I think there could have been more creative ways to make the game harder, like adding different boss fight mechanics and different phases. I think stuff like that would have been really cool. And speaking of that post game, yeah, I don't really feel like there is one. So when you get to the end game, you have access to chaos difficulty. What this lets you do is you can use anima crystals and shards to unlock higher levels to push you all the way up to the cap of 300. This also lets you unlock limit releases for certain classes. Complete the mission, you get a limit release. This ups the level cap on certain jobs, and this leads to job mastery points. The problem with this system is that it feels unnecessary. Job mastery points are cool in idea, but they really don't amount to anything but additional stat boosts for whenever you have that class on. That stuff is pretty boring. You finally get to min-max, and attributing and having good builds finally matters, but why play more? It's just the same game over again. You could even skip most of the game depending on how good you are at the game and leveling yourself up. It feels like an unnecessary addition. It feels like Borderlands' true Vault Hunter mode without the incentive to play more. Whenever you load up Borderlands and you beat normal mode, you're like, cool, I get to level up more, get more cornerstone skills, get to have better legendaries, and my loot chances are going to go up. The game's harder. It feels different. Not in this game. We played a couple of chaos levels and we were just kind of like, yeah, it's definitely just more of the same. Doesn't feel different, doesn't feel unique, and it's kind of tedious in a way as well, because you need anima crystals to unlock these levels, and you have to do certain levels specifically to limit raise your levels up to 99. Feels more tedious than what it should be. I think there needs to be a better defined post game, like better side quests, something to actually make you want to play more of the post game. Because we're only about 2 achievements away from 100%ing the game, and I don't think we're really going to play again unless they make DLC. A little point before the end is the audio and visuals, and truly honestly, it was quite forgettable. I really don't remember the soundtrack. I'm someone who really likes soundtracks. I love Nier soundtrack, I love Life is Strange soundtrack, I like having these really cool, memorable songs playing at moments. I don't think it's a huge detriment not having a great soundtrack, but I think when you have Final Fantasy, I think you could raise the bar a little bit. Maybe it was just me, but I just didn't really find it memorable. A lot of people said that the graphics weren't particularly good, but I'll be honest, I really didn't think they were that bad. Some people were saying, oh, this game looks horrible, this doesn't look nothing like a next-gen, current 2022 game. I think it was fine. I was playing on the Xbox One S, I thought it looked fine. My friend was playing on the Xbox Series X, and I think it looked fine. It's average at worst, average at best. I think it's truly just neutral. I don't really think it matters all that much. It is not that bad. So with all that being said, it's time for the verdict. In my opinion, as someone who was a fan of Souls-likes, action RPGs, and Final Fantasy games as a whole, I really liked this game. I really thought it was fun. I bought into the whole campy, it's not going to take itself serious, it's going to be edgy, it's going to be crazy, but at the end of the day, it's a super fun, Neo-like game. I thought it was really cool. If I had to give it a number, I'd say it's an 8 out of 10, a solid game. The stipulation I'd say though is you have to know what you're getting into. If you're fine with the story being straight out of 2005, Jack Garland being straight out of a 2005 edgy Limp Bizkit music video,
bullshit.
coming at the speed of light. So stay within the zone.
He's out there. I can feel him.
Then you're going to have a great time. The gameplay loop itself, I think, is enough to lock in whoever wants to try this game. If that isn't your style, though, and you want a more serious, grounded story, that's not your type of thing, I think you could give this one a pass. Or at least I'd say try it on sale because, again, the gameplay loop I think is just that good. It's far from a perfect game. I think it'd be a far cry to say this is a masterpiece, but at the end of the day, playing it both solo and multiplayer, I thought it was a very fun, very great experience. My friend is someone who has never even played a Final Fantasy game before, and he thought it was really good. And to be honest, I thought it was great. We played through the game pretty much almost no-lifing it over the course of a week, and it was a super fun time. I'd highly recommend it to anyone who wants to play it. If you're a Final Fantasy longtime fan, if you're an action RPG fan, if you're a Souls-like fan, I think it's great. And even if you aren't fans of those types, I think the gameplay itself is perfected enough to where I think you should give it a try. All in all, I'd say you definitely should buy it, in my humble opinion. Well, boys, finally pulled out a serious video. Leave any constructive criticisms in the comments, any agreements, disagreements. I'm pretty interested with how divisive this game can be at times to see what you think, and I'll see y'all later, boys.